The Sherlock Holmes Advent Calendar. An Odyssey Through Jerusalem by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Nora Godwin. Narrated by Peter Silverleaf. 15. The Gate of Darkness. Since there was nothing left to see or investigate, we left the area of the Wailing Wall again. The latest attack had proved to be a sensational but ultimately harmless propaganda campaign, even though it could be of severe consequence. At my request, we took a small detour to circle the base of the Temple Mount in a northerly direction. The fact that this would also lead us back to the Muslim quarter, and thus our destination, my companions had no objection to this small detour. "I would also like to go up to the plateau," I told Sella. "Can this be set up?" The Palestinian looked at me with a serious face and declared, "No problem, Dr. Watson. All you have to do is convert to Islam first." "The Temple Mount is a Haram district," Holmes added. "As a matter of principle, non-Muslims are not permitted to enter. Only a few exceptions are made, for example for important state guests, but even in these cases prior approval from the authorities is needed." "Maybe I can make that possible," Salah promised with a half-serious face. "For all I care, it can even be done without conversion to the right faith. It is your sinful life, after all. In the event that we successfully put a stop to our perpetrators, however, a corresponding request may actually and even gladly be granted, but one after another." "I understand," I replied, a little disappointed. "Then, for the time being, I will be content with the view from below." We reached the northwest corner and turned east accordingly. As we approached the access to the Temple Mount, the so-called Gate of Darkness, we noticed that the plateau had now been completely sealed off. A detachment of about 30 Osmanic soldiers had built a barrier and now consistently denied even Muslims access to Jerusalem's most important Islamic sanctuaries, and especially the prayer in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Salah approached the commanding officer to question him about the situation. When he came back to us after a minute, he told us that due to the incident at the Wailing Wall, the area had been completely barred. No one is allowed to pass. In front of the barriers, a group of around 100 Muslims had already gathered, demanding their right to visit the sacred sites. A fierce altercation with the posted soldiers was taking place. In response, the protesters were sharply rebuked. We watched the events from a distance and did not want to interfere any further. "It seems to me that the faithful are not happy about this measure," Holmes nevertheless noted. "You might be right," Salah confirmed. He was also not happy about the developments. "Honestly, I understand their objection. This closure seems somewhat exaggerated. No wonder believers see it more as punishment rather than a security necessity. This is an explosive situation." In the next few moments it should become clear that this assessment was correct. Suddenly stones were thrown from the crowd at the soldiers. One of the Ottomans was hit in the head and fell to the ground with a bleeding wound. The officer, who had previously spoken to Salah, drew his sabre and shouted a command in Turkish. As a result, the soldiers advanced against the crowd to forcibly drive them away. This caused a commotion in which the protesters retreated, but continued to cover the Ottomans with hails of stones. And then our worst fear became reality. A shot was heard somewhere around the location. Screaming and panic followed. The crowd dispersed and disappeared into the adjacent alleys, whereupon the officer called back his soldiers. But on the spot in front of the gate, a man had been left behind, laying on the ground. Obviously, he had been hit by the shot. "There is an injured person," I shouted, and immediately ran to check on the man. "Wait," Salah tried in vain to hold me back, only to follow me immediately. Within a few seconds, I reached the man, 2 boys kneeling beside him, barely over 10 years old. I immediately realized that the man had been hit in the chest. His white clothes and the ground was already colored red by the escaping blood. "Make room, I'm a doctor," I said as I bent over the injured, but the 2 boys didn't follow until Salah translated my request into Arabic. The smaller of the 2 started crying. In the meantime, we got more company, namely Holmes, who had come after us more leisurely, and the Ottoman officer, who also wanted to see what was going on. He and Salah seem to be discussing the incident, and our Palestinian colleague apparently wants to express his indignation. I did not understand a word of the fiery discussion, but I was too focused on taking care of the injured person anyway to even try to interpret any of the words spoken in Turkish. The bullet must have penetrated deeply, at least just next to the heart, but presumably the lungs of my acute patient had been perforated. He was maybe in his mid-30s, breathing heavily and looking at me with sad eyes. "Are these your children?" I asked to distract the man from the pain. He confirmed my guess with a slow closing and opening of the eyelids. Holmes also knelt down next to me. Together we tried to stop the bleeding with our handkerchiefs. However, I had been long aware that this would be in vain. The injured Arab would inevitably die. The man's 2 sons looked anxiously over our shoulders. The father whispered a few quiet words to them. Then blood came out of his mouth. He coughed and struggled for air. Holmes and I looked at each other. I shook my head tellingly. The body of the dying man twitched one last time. Then the man closed his eyes and took his last breath. He had left the plains of the living. I slowly stood up and looked at my hands, which were full of the deceased's blood. Holmes took off his coat and covered the body with it. We turned to Salah and the officer, and both had a sorrow-stricken face. During all this time we had all lost sight of the 2 children, and while the younger boy mourned his father, the older boy did not want to accept this murder so easily. He had sneaked up on the side of the officer unnoticed and pulled his sabre out of his belt with the intention to give it back as he was given. Fortunately, at the last moment, Salah stopped the boy, and the sword fell clinking on the stone floor. The attacked officer retreated 2 steps in shock, but then immediately drew his pistol, which he pointed trembling at the boy. The threat of a second murder lingering in the air. Only this time it would be a child. But while the soldier fortunately still hesitated to actually pull the trigger, Salah stepped in again. He now stood between the officer and the boy. A resounding clap was to be heard as Salah slapped the boy in his face and grabbed him by the right ear to pull him away from the Ottoman officer, who still had the pistol ready. When our Palestinian colleague assessed the distance as far enough, he let go of the boy, gave him a few more haunting words in Arabic, and sent him away together with his brother. They took each other's hands and quickly disappeared. The Turk had followed this process almost apathetically. He now put his weapon back into the holster, picked up his sabre from the ground, and returned to his post at the Gate of Darkness. "It would be better if we also left," Holmes said. "Quickly." Salah nodded, looked back on the covered corpse again, and then we also left, only to disappear into the alleys of the old town. We were silent for a few minutes. Then I finally spoke out what everyone was thinking anyway. "This should never have happened." "No, we are on the verge of a terrible escalation," Salah added. "A civilian, a devout Muslim, a family man has died, senselessly and at the hands of an Ottoman soldier. The mood among the population will be further heated up as a result. We must put an end to the whole thing all the sooner. Otherwise more people will inevitably die. And the 2 boys—" "Are you beating yourself up," I interrupted his thoughts, "for raising your hand on the elder?" "It is not very honourable to raise one's hand against children," Salah noted. "But it is extremely honourable," Holmes immediately replied, "to save a child's life. I know what you have done, and so does God. If you had not immediately held the boy responsible for his ill-considered attack by raising your hand, the officer would probably have shot him. This is how a wise, spiritually present and just man acts." Salah did not react to the encouragement, but continued undeterred with a lowered gaze in the direction of his house. "Will the soldier who fired the shot be held accountable?" I asked. "That's unlikely," Holmes said. "The Ottoman will know how to prevent this. Either one will claim that the shooter can no longer be identified, or speak of an unintentionally released shot. The person responsible has no other consequences to fear than to be sent back to his Anatolian homeland immediately, and there he will probably be given an order of bravery." "For the murder of unarmed civilians," I added. "For successful counter-insurgency," Holmes replied. "Of course, this is very short-term thinking, and Salah is right. Pandora's box may have been opened." Finally, we reached the house of our now silent host. He excused himself for the rest of the day on the grounds that he was tired and needed to think. Of course, we respected his wish and retired to the room assigned to us. "What do you think, Holmes?" I started when we were alone. "Does Salah have any doubts about whether he is on the right side in this conflict?" My friend thought for some time. Then he said, "Today he will probably have them, but tomorrow he will have overcome them. He is a responsible police officer who knows his duties. He will know that there is only one way to deal with the situation. The attacks must end, then the unrest and its repression will end. That is our mission. The rest is a matter of politics. A solution for Jerusalem that makes all peoples and all religions in it happy has to be found. Then the sacrifices were not in vain. In order to come to this conclusion, Salah will probably need a bottle of raki today. Alone. Tomorrow we will go to work together, all the more committed." I was hoping that Holmes would be right. It took me a long time to clean my bloody hands in a water bowl. It was much more difficult to me than it once was for the Roman governor Pontius Pilate to make sure that I had done my utmost to prevent an unnecessary death and wash my sins away. I thought of the 2 children who had come home to their mother today only to tell her about the death of their father, her husband. And as the older boy had already shown, grief can quickly turn into anger, especially if there is an injustice. At the same time, after this death, the Ottoman authorities could subsequently shed some inhibitions that had previously maintained peace. By sealing off the Gate of Darkness, the Ottomans had opened another gate, the path of which led straight to hell. And Holmes and I would have to seal this port into the sinister damnation by, as Holmes rightly noted, working on our task with bright hearts and clear, wide-awake mind.